Imagine standing on a quiet city street, minding your own business, when a cop confronts you, fueled by prejudice. One punch changes everything. But what happens when he realizes he just attacked the wrong man? Buckle up for a jaw-dropping story of justice and power that'll leave you speechless. Hit play now. A prejudiced police officer clashes intensely with a black man outside a high-end boutique. The encounter spirals rapidly, culminating in the officer striking and detaining the man. Yet, the cop soon discovers the shocking identity of the person he just assaulted. Before we jump into this tale, make sure to smash that subscribe button to catch more thrilling stories. James Carter, a black mayor of a prominent city, lingered outside a luxury shop one late evening. The urban bustle had faded, and the affluent district was hushed, with streetlights casting a gentle glow across the pavement. Dressed impeccably in a suit after a lengthy evening meeting, James awaited his assistant, Michael, to collect him. The boutique beside him had long since shuttered, its dark windows mirroring his lone silhouette. James glanced at his phone, irritation mounting as Michael was delayed once more. He rested lightly against the shop's glass entrance, his gaze sweeping the deserted street for approaching headlights. While he peered into the silent night, the sound of firm footsteps snapped him back to the present. "Hey, what's your business here?" A gruff voice abruptly pierced the calm. James looked up to find a white police officer, Officer Daniel Harris, advancing with wary eyes. The officer's hand lingered near his belt, inches from his baton, as if bracing for trouble. Harris's piercing stare sized James up, as though evaluating a possible danger. James knew that posture all too well. It wasn't new to him. As a black man wielding authority, he'd frequently endured biased glares and mistreatment due to his skin color. He'd steeled himself for such encounters, yet they always stirred unease within him. "What are you up to?" Harris pressed again, his voice now cutting, implying James was up to no good. James stood tall, slipped his phone into his pocket, and replied evenly, "I'm just waiting for a ride." The officer halted a few paces from James, his eyes still laced with doubt, as he scanned the empty street. "Loitering here at this hour, by a closed shop?" Harris probed, his tone more accusatory than curious. "Correct," James answered calmly. "My driver's running behind." Officer Harris fixed his gaze on James, his hand brushing closer to the baton at his side. "That doesn't add up. Are you sure you're not skulking around planning something?" James felt annoyance swelling inside but kept his expression composed. "I'm not skulking. I'm simply standing here, waiting for my car, that's all." Harris smirked, but it lacked warmth. "Standing there in that fancy suit, eh? Trying to pass yourself off as someone important?" James held Harris's stare, catching the slight but staying steady. "I'm waiting for my ride, officer. That's the only thing going on here." Harris inched closer, the air between them growing charged. "I'm not buying it. You look out of place here, alone at night. You sure you're not up to no good?" James's pulse quickened, but he knew he had to tread carefully. He'd faced moments where no explanation sufficed, where bias and unchecked power drowned out reason. "There's no cause for suspicion," James said, his voice firm yet measured. "I've done nothing wrong. I'm just waiting for my ride." Harris stood rigid, his intense eyes locked on James, as if anticipating a slip. "Got any ID?" Harris demanded sharply. James tightened his jaw, but hid his frustration. "I don't need to show ID when I've committed no crime." Harris's eyes narrowed, his hand edging toward his belt. "That's not your call. When I demand ID, you hand it over, or are you concealing something?" James inhaled deeply, battling the anger rising within. "I've explained my purpose here. That should suffice. There's no need to push this further." Harris stepped nearer, now mere inches away. "I decide how far this goes, not you," he said, his voice low and menacing. "Right now, you're giving me plenty of cause to probe deeper." James held his position, his eyes unwavering, but his body tense, sensing this wouldn't resolve easily. Beneath the quiet night sky, with streetlights casting long shadows, the standoff between the two men grew increasingly volatile. The strain between them intensified with every moment. Officer Harris's gaze no longer held mere doubt. It now radiated a clear intent to dominate. He aimed to force James into submission, but James knew yielding without reason would validate the injustice he'd faced his entire life. "I've already explained," James said again, his voice steady but firm. "I've done no wrong, and I don't need to provide ID. I'm waiting for my car." Harris shook his head slightly, his smirk vanishing, replaced by resolve. "You don't get to call the shots. When I ask for ID, you comply. That's the law, or are you hiding something?" James sighed inwardly. He'd faced such moments before, times when words meant nothing and power dictated all. But now he knew caution was critical. He wasn't just any citizen, he was the city's mayor, and that meant avoiding an unnecessary clash, especially when bias and unchecked authority fueled the moment. "I've been clear," James said, his eyes fixed on Harris's. "I'm standing here awaiting my ride. There's no basis for groundless accusations. You lack any valid reason to demand my ID." Yet Officer Harris didn't relent. He closed the gap further, now nearly nose to nose with James. His hand hovered closer to his belt, where his handcuffs and baton dangled. The atmosphere thickened, as if a single word could spark a clash. "You don't fit here," Harris snarled. "Hanging around at night, in that suit, by a closed shop. You sure you're not scheming something?" James sensed Harris losing restraint. The irritation simmering within James surged, not from fear, but from the stark unfairness of it all. Still, he stayed composed, aware that one wrong move could spiral the situation out of control. "I have every right to be here, just like anyone," James said, his voice now edged with steel. "I told you I'm waiting for my car, nothing more." Harris's taunting smirk returned. "Yeah, I've heard that excuse before. You being here makes no sense, and I don't think you belong." James shut his eyes briefly, reining in his mounting frustration. He'd endured countless instances of unfair treatment, but this felt distinct. This officer wasn't merely wary, he was pushing James, trying to paint him as a criminal simply for his skin color. "Then hear me clearly," James said, his tone sharpening. "I've done nothing wrong. I'm not a criminal, and you have no grounds to question me like this. If you've got a real reason, state it. Otherwise, leave me alone." Harris stepped even closer, now inches from James's face. "I don't buy your story," he said, his voice dripping with provocation. "You think you can dodge me? I'm the one running this show, not you." James clenched his fists, struggling to stay calm. He knew the situation was escalating pointlessly, and one misstep could send it crashing. "I owe you no further explanation," James said, his voice tinged with resolve. "If I've broken a law, prove it. Otherwise, you're just intimidating me because you think you can." Harris bared his teeth, his eyes blazing with rage. "Watch your tone. You're inches from crossing a line." "What line?" James shot back, his voice defiant yet controlled. "The one where you use your badge to shove me off a public street?" The officer glared at James, his hand now gripping the handcuffs. The air was so thick with tension that a single move could set it ablaze. James knew he couldn't let things worsen, but he also refused to bow to abuse of power. "You think you're clever, huh?" Harris said, his voice laced with spite. "You think you can mouth off to me? I'm the authority here, not you." James stared back, his voice calm but resolute. "Authority doesn't let you harass someone without cause." Harris leaned in, nearly touching James's face. "I don't need a cause," he said, his voice brimming with threat. "If I feel threatened, I handle it my way. And right now, I don't like your attitude." James knew the situation was careening out of control. Harris wasn't just questioning him, He was itching for a fight, and James had to be cautious. "I'm not threatening you," James said, his voice firm but even. "I'm standing here, unarmed, waiting for my ride, and you're the one making threats." The standoff grew even more fraught, and James sensed that one wrong word or move could push things past the point of no return. Yet James wasn't one to accept injustice lightly, and despite the danger, he knew he had to hold his ground. The tension hit a breaking point. Officer Harris showed no sign of backing off. His hostility grew clearer by the second. His hand lingered on his handcuffs, as if waiting for any excuse to detain James. James felt the situation slipping despite his efforts to stay rational and composed. Harris seemed hell-bent on seeing James as a danger. "You're testing my patience," Harris said, his voice icy. "I'm done asking. Show me your ID, or I'm arresting you for resisting an officer." James tried to steady his breathing to keep his cool, but he felt the encounter had crossed into absurdity. He locked eyes with the officer, his hand still. "I've said it before," he stated, his voice unwavering but firm. "I don't need to show ID because I've done nothing wrong. You're harassing me for no reason." That pushed Harris over the edge. "Fine, you've gone too far," he snarled, lunging at James. Without warning, Harris seized James's wrist and jerked him toward the shop's glass door. The sudden yank threw James off balance, causing him to crash into the door with enough force to make it shudder. His shoulder slammed into the hard surface, pain radiating through his arm and chest. "What are you doing?" James shouted, anger surging within but still trying to avoid overreacting. "Quiet," Harris barked, twisting James around to press his face against the glass. "You've crossed the line, and now you'll learn what the law means." James fought to stay calm, but the sense of powerlessness and unfairness made it tough. He never thought waiting for a ride outside a shop could lead to this. He felt Harris's force as the officer pinned him against the glass, reaching for his cuffs. "I said I didn't do anything," James yelled, trying to free his arm from Harris's grip while keeping his movements restrained to avoid a resisting arrest charge. "You're fighting me?" Harris hissed, his eyes alight with fury. "You think you're above the law? I'll show you who's boss." Without pause, Harris shoved James again, pinning his shoulder and face against the glass with brutal force. James grimaced, the pain spreading from his shoulder to his arm. But before he could speak, Harris raised his fist and delivered a vicious punch to James's face. The blow was savage, snapping James's head to the side, his vision briefly fading as pain erupted from his jaw to his temple. The world spun, and James struggled to stay upright. For a moment, James stood stunned, trying to regain his bearings. He touched his cheek, where the punch's sharp sting pulsed. Rage and helplessness flooded his mind. "You can't do this!" James shouted, his voice straining against the overwhelming pain. "I've done nothing wrong." But Harris didn't stop. He grabbed James again, yanking him down to the sidewalk with force. James stumbled, trying not to collapse, but the pain and anger clouded his reactions. Harris had decided James was guilty and would use any means to prove it. "That was your last mistake," Harris said, his voice cold and unrestrained. He forced James to the ground, pinning his wrist and snapping the steel handcuffs around it. The cuffs locked with a sharp click, and James felt the metal dig into his skin. "Now you'll learn to respect the law," Harris said. James lay on the ground, breathing heavily as pain coursed through him. The injustice burned like fire within him. He couldn't fathom that waiting for a ride had led to being cuffed and beaten by someone meant to uphold justice. "You'll regret this," James said, his voice steady despite the pain. Even in this dire moment, he knew he held a truth Harris didn't yet grasp. "No, you'll be the one regretting," Harris sneered, believing he still held the upper hand. "You're not above the law." James caught his breath, his mind clearing after the punch. Despite the assault and wrongful arrest, he clung to one thought. His true power was yet to be unveiled. He had a trump card, and that moment would force Harris to face the consequences. Staring at Harris with icy resolve, James said, Before you toss me in your patrol car, why not check my ID? Harris froze, his hands poised to push James into the vehicle, then hesitated. What? He asked, doubt creeping into his eyes. James met Harris's gaze, his voice now calm and assured. Check my ID. It's in my wallet. You'll want to know who you just cuffed before you go further. Harris wavered, his face betraying confusion and unease. You had all night to show me your ID. Why now? James held his stare, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. I told you. Check it. You don't want to lock me up without knowing who you're dealing with. James's confidence rattled Harris, his aggression waning. Harris reached into James's pocket, retrieved his wallet, and flipped it open. His rough fingers pulled out the ID card. When he read it, his face blanched, the color draining as the truth hit. Mayor James Carter. Officer Harris stood paralyzed, his eyes glued to the ID in his trembling hand. The arrogance and hostility he'd shown moments ago evaporated, replaced by sheer panic. Time seemed to stop as Harris realized he'd just attacked and arrested Mayor James Carter, the city's leader. Mayor, Harris stammered, his eyes still locked on the card. I didn't know. James, despite the throbbing pain in his shoulder and the stinging ache on his face, stayed composed. He rose slowly, ignoring the pain, and fixed Harris with a steady gaze. That's right. I'm the mayor, James said, his voice clear and commanding. And you've just made a grave error. Harris remained frozen, his hands shaking as he clutched the ID. His nervous glance darted around. His earlier bravado was gone. He couldn't process what had just happened. Sir, I didn't know you were the mayor. I didn't mean… He fumbled for his keys, clumsily unlocking James's cuffs, his hands trembling so much he nearly dropped them. James maintained his piercing stare, feeling relief as the cuffs came off. He rubbed his swollen wrists, but his voice stayed firm. You didn't know because you didn't care to find out. You let your bias and assumptions guide you. Harris stepped back, fear now clear in his eyes. Sir, I didn't think, he stuttered, grasping for an excuse but finding none. James cut him off, his tone sharp, yet controlled. That's the issue. You didn't think. You saw me and assumed I was trouble. You ignored my words, no matter how clear. All you saw was my skin and where I stood, a place you thought I didn't belong. Harris retreated further, his face red with shame, not anger. Sir, I didn't mean. I was just doing my job. Punching me is your job? James asked, his voice growing colder. Using force and cuffing someone without cause is your job? Or is that just a cover for your prejudice and power abuse? Harris had no response. He couldn't justify himself, no excuse held up against the clear truth. His eyes flickered with fear, unable to meet James's gaze. He knew his career, maybe his life, had shifted in this moment. Sir, I'm sorry, Harris mumbled, regret etched on his face. I didn't mean it. James cut in again, his voice brimming with authority. Sorry doesn't cut it. You misused your power. You let bias drive you. You thought you could act this way without consequences. Harris took another step back, his face pale. Sir, please, I'll lose my job. I didn't know who you were. I didn't mean… James didn't budge. You shouldn't need to know who I am to treat me with basic fairness. That's what every citizen deserves from the police. Harris stood mute, knowing his mistake was irreparable. No words could undo the situation. James massaged his sore wrists, his eyes still locked on Harris. Give me your badge number now, James said icily. Harris quickly complied, his hands shaking as he jotted it down. James entered the number into his phone, never breaking eye contact. You'll hear from me soon, James said firmly. And next time, you won't escape so easily. With that, James turned and strode away, leaving Harris frozen in fear and regret. Though he'd endured a brutal, unjust ordeal, James refused to let anger consume him. He knew this wasn't just about him. It was about a flawed policing system, about power and prejudice, and the reforms needed. As James hurried from the quiet streetlights casting shadows on the sidewalk, he dialed his assistant, Michael. "Michael," James said, his voice urgent and serious. "Meet me at City Hall now. We've got work to do." Without waiting for a reply, James ended the call, his gaze fixed ahead, his mind set on the next steps. This wasn't just a clash with an abusive officer. It was a chance to drive real change, and James knew he had the authority to make it happen. This story doesn't end with the wrong James faced. It's the start of a broader fight to overhaul the systemic flaws in the city's police force. James moved with purpose, leaving Officer Harris rooted in panic. The officer's face remained ashen as he grasped the weight of his error. James didn't glance back, but he knew Harris stood there, reeling from the consequences awaiting him. The injustice had played out before James's eyes, and now it was time to channel his fury into action. As James left the silent street, his thoughts raced with how this incident could ignite citywide change. He'd faced racism before, but this time, he was resolved to ensure it didn't stop with his own experience. As mayor, he had a duty to prevent such incidents from recurring for anyone. When he reached City Hall, Michael was waiting, concern etched on his face. "James, what's wrong?" "Your voice on the phone scared me," Michael said. James exhaled, rubbing his wrists where the cuffs had bitten. "A cop just attacked and wrongfully arrested me for standing on a sidewalk waiting for my car," he said. Michael froze, his face paling. "What? How could that happen to the mayor?" James looked at Michael, his eyes burning with resolve. "That's the problem. It wasn't about my title, but because I'm a black man in a rich neighborhood. Harris didn't bother to listen or check. He saw my skin and labeled me a threat. This isn't just my fight, Michael. It's a system riddled with bias and abuse, and I won't let it slide." Michael stared, anger and worry mixing on his face. "What's the plan?" James replied with conviction. "We take action. I've got the officer's badge number, and we're filing a formal complaint first. But that's only the start. I'll ensure this case goes public, and that cop faces consequences. Beyond that, I'm pushing for sweeping police reforms." Michael nodded, determination growing in his eyes. "I'm with you. This can't just be a private grievance," James agreed, his gaze unwavering. "Exactly. We're taking this to the top. We'll file with the police department and the chief, and if they don't handle it openly, I'll go public. The city needs to know. This isn't minor, and it won't be buried." Right away, Michael and James got to work. They compiled evidence: James's ID, Officer Harris's details, and a detailed account of the event. James prepared a formal complaint, but he knew an internal probe alone wouldn't suffice. He needed more. Hours later, the complaint was filed with the police department. But James didn't stop there. He knew internal handling risked a cover-up. His next step was a direct meeting with the city's police chief, Chief Thompson. The following day, James arrived at the police station with Michael, both wearing grave expressions. As they entered, officers recognized James, and an uneasy hush fell as they noticed the faint bruise on his face. A receptionist stood when James approached. "I need to see Chief Thompson," James said curtly, his tone brooking no argument. The receptionist nodded quickly and made a call. Moments later, Chief Thompson, a tall man with graying hair and a stern demeanor, appeared in the hallway, approaching James with a tense expression. "Mayor Carter," Thompson said, his voice steady but uneasy. "Let's talk in my office." James nodded silently and followed Thompson inside. Once the door closed, Thompson sighed and sat behind his desk. "I've heard about last night's incident. It's a serious matter," Thompson said. James remained standing, locking eyes with Thompson. "It is, and I'm not here for a chat. I demand a full investigation into Officer Harris's actions. He abused his authority with clear racial bias. This won't be hushed up or settled quietly." Thompson took a deep breath, his eyes showing strain. "I understand, and I'm committed to addressing this thoroughly. Officer Harris is already suspended pending investigation." James showed no satisfaction. "A suspension isn't enough. I want this handled publicly, transparently, with harsh consequences for wrongdoing. This isn't personal, it's a systemic failure. And if the system won't fix itself, I'll take it to the public." Thompson studied James for a moment before nodding, his voice softer. "I get it. You have my assurance. We won't hide anything, and misconduct will face consequences." James finally sat, his eyes never leaving Thompson's. "I hope you mean that, because if not, I'll use every resource I have as mayor and citizen to demand justice." Thompson stayed quiet, then nodded. "I understand." The meeting ended swiftly, but James knew it was just the start. The battle for justice and systemic reform had begun, and he wouldn't rest until it was done. Leaving the station, James felt a mix of resolve and caution. Thompson's promise might not hold. This wasn't about one officer. It was a deep-rooted issue, and the system had dodged reform too long. James had to ensure the promise was kept, despite the challenges ahead. Days later, a pivotal meeting took place at City Hall with key figures: Chief Thompson, police union reps, and senior city officials. James entered as a leader, not just for himself, but for all who'd faced similar injustices. The room went quiet as he walked in, eyes drawn to the faint bruise on his face. James took the head of the table, facing Thompson and the union reps. Thompson sat stiffly, tension in his eyes. The union members sat opposite, their gazes defensive, given James's recent ordeal. The meeting opened with formalities and Thompson's update on the investigation into Officer Harris. "Harris is suspended, and we're conducting a thorough probe. I assure you it'll be transparent," Thompson said, striving for professionalism. James leaned forward, his gaze icy and resolute. "I'm not here for one officer's suspension. We can't fix this by targeting one person without tackling the whole system. It's time for real action and police reform." A police union rep, a tall man with a stern frown, spoke up. "Mayor, we respect the process, but that officer was just doing his job. If we're not careful, singling out individuals could hurt the entire force's morale." James paused, his stare sharpening. "Are you saying assaulting and wrongfully arresting someone is his job?" he asked, his voice firm and unyielding. "If so, we have a bigger problem than I thought. That officer's actions reflect a system that enables power abuse and racial bias." The union reps were visibly shaken by James's words. "Mayor, we agree it needs a thorough investigation, but balance is key. Heavy reforms could spark backlash in the force," another rep said. James scowled, recognizing the resistance he'd faced from the union and police leadership. Backlash comes from dodging accountability, not reform. If our police feel threatened by transparency and justice, that's the issue, and I won't let this city tolerate it. Chief Thompson stayed silent briefly, then spoke. "I agree, change is needed, but it takes time. Major reforms will face pushback from the union and officers. We can't overhaul a system overnight." James leaned back, his voice cutting. "I'm not asking for instant change, but we can't keep stalling. Action is needed now. The community and I have waited long enough. Without real steps, I'll take this to the public." The room's tension spiked as officials, officers, and reps realized James wouldn't budge. He wasn't just seeking personal justice. He represented a community demanding change. His experience was a symptom of what others endured silently, and James wouldn't let it persist. "What's our next move?" James asked, his gaze sweeping the room. "Reform isn't optional, it's essential." Without fixing this system from the ground up, we'll lose public trust for good." Some city officials, previously silent, nodded in agreement. They knew James's words held moral and political weight. Protests could flare if the public felt unprotected, and without reform, the city risked a larger crisis. The meeting pressed on with specific proposals. James called for an independent oversight committee to probe police misconduct and mandatory training on racial bias and de-escalation for all officers. These were initial steps in a tough journey to reform the system. Despite pushback, Chief Thompson eventually conceded the measures were needed. "I'll work with the force's leadership and union to enact these reforms. We must ensure the system stops tolerating abuse," he said. James nodded, knowing it was just a start. "Good," he said firmly. "But if there's no progress, I won't hesitate to take this citywide, and there'll be no turning back." The meeting closed with tentative agreement, but James knew the real fight lay ahead. Reforms would face fierce opposition from those resistant to change, and the process wouldn't be simple. Yet, with his authority, James was ready to push for justice and transparency in the police force. As he left the meeting room, Michael walked beside him, asking quietly, "Do you think they'll follow through?" James sighed, but held his resolve. "They'll have no choice. We'll make sure of it." After the meeting, James knew the true battle was just starting. Though Thompson and the union agreed to reforms, James saw the resistance from a system reluctant to shift. Promises made in the room were hollow without action. The next day, James held a press conference at City Hall, choosing to publicize the incident and reforms to prevent dismissal. Outside City Hall, reporters and citizens gathered in droves, eager to hear from the mayor who'd faced a brutal injustice from the city's police. James stepped to the podium, his expression determined. Reporters below raised cameras and notepads, capturing his words. Sunlight illuminated his face, highlighting the bruise, a vivid reminder of the incident. "Good afternoon," James began, his voice resonant and firm. "Today, I speak not just as this city's mayor, but as a citizen who's felt the sting of injustice from the system we aim to fix." The crowd hushed, hanging on James's every word. "Days ago, a police officer assaulted and arrested me for standing on a sidewalk awaiting my car. This isn't just my story. It reflects a deeper systemic flaw, where bias and power abuse are so entrenched that even I, the mayor, can face such treatment." James paused, letting the weight of his words settle. He sensed the crowd's growing outrage, realizing if this could happen to him, it could happen to anyone. "But I'm not here to dwell on that moment," James continued, his voice gaining strength. "I'm here to demand change. We can't fix this by blaming one officer. The problem is the system, and my administration, with city leaders, has decided now is the time to act." James faced the cameras, speaking to every citizen watching. "We'll create an independent oversight committee to investigate police misconduct claims. This group will operate outside police control, with full access to records. No longer will incidents be buried or handled in secret." A ripple of applause spread through the crowd, but James stayed focused, his message unfinished. "We'll also require all officers to undergo de-escalation and anti-racism training. This won't be a one-off, but part of their ongoing training. Every officer must understand the community they serve and be accountable for their actions." The applause grew louder as the crowd rallied behind James's bold stance. He felt their support, knowing he was voicing what many had long awaited. "And finally," James said, his voice rising, "we'll publicize all police misconduct complaints and investigation updates. These issues won't stay hidden behind closed doors. This city's people deserve a police force that protects, not threatens, them." Cheers and applause erupted. James knew these weren't just promises, but steps toward systemic change. Yet, he understood the long, tough road ahead. After the press conference, public reaction was swift. Social media buzzed with police reform hashtags, with many backing James's plans. Civil rights groups and community leaders strongly supported the measures, urging immediate action. But, as James expected, not all approved. The police union and some officers publicly slammed the reforms, arguing the Oversight Committee infringed on police authority and training would sap officers' resolve. They warned the measures could spike crime by making officers hesitant. James anticipated resistance. In later meetings with Thompson and city officials, he kept pushing for reform implementation. Though Thompson vowed transparency, he cautioned about internal pushback. "Mayor, I support your plans," Thompson said privately, "but these changes won't come easily. Many officers feel threatened by outside oversight." James locked eyes with Thompson. "Chief, if accountability scares them, they don't belong in the force. This is about saving public trust. If we don't act now, it'll only worsen." Thompson fell silent, knowing James was right. Despite concerns about officer backlash, he saw the system couldn't stay as is. The meetings ended with a pledge to enact James's reforms, but he knew it was just the start. Many in the force would resist, and the union would keep obstructing. Still, James wouldn't back down. As James and Michael left City Hall after a grueling day, Michael asked, concern in his voice, "Can we push through?" The union and force pushback could be fierce. James looked ahead, eyes fierce with determination. "We will. This isn't about minor fixes. It's a fight for truth and justice, and I won't stop until we win." With that, James pressed forward, knowing the battle wasn't over, but ready to fight to transform the system. Post-press conferences, the police union's opposition grew stark. They launched a campaign against James's reforms, claiming the Oversight Committee and anti-racism training would crush the force's spirit and weaken policing. Resistance wasn't just verbal. Some officers openly showed discontent, even hinting at strikes. They argued excessive oversight would hinder their work. The union claimed reforms would tank morale and curb crime-fighting ability. James, facing steep challenges, stood firm. He held more community meetings, hearing citizens' voices and pushing for change. He saw that countering internal resistance required strong public support, the very people the system should serve. With community backing, peaceful protests and media campaigns spread citywide, demanding true police reform. The public became active allies in James's fight. Civil rights groups, leaders, and citizens publicly championed reform, their pressure forcing officials and Thompson to speed up the agreed measures. James never faltered amid union criticism or threats. He knew change was tough, especially when challenging a biased, unchecked system. He pushed on, aware the journey would face strong opposition from those against change. Media kept covering James's fight, spotlighting challenges and early reform progress. Public support grew, empowering him further. Larger peaceful protests showed the city's resolve for justice and transparency in policing. Despite resistance, community pressure, and James's relentless drive led to some reforms taking root. The Oversight Committee was formed, and anti-racism and de-escalation training became mandatory. Change was slow, but steps were underway. James knew the fight was ongoing. The union and some officers kept obstructing, but he believed public support and pressure would force systemic change. It was a tough path, but he was on the right track, determined to see justice through. Though obstacles loomed, James felt his efforts were starting to shift the system. The slow, challenging police system was beginning to change, a first victory for him and the community. Over time, the reforms James and the community championed began to show impact. The Oversight Committee started work, and public reports on misconduct cases emerged. Progress was slower than hoped, but transparency and accountability became priorities, boosting public trust. Racial bias and de-escalation training rolled out across the force. participating officers began rethinking law enforcement and community interactions. Though some resisted, James saw these as vital steps to rebuild trust and create a fairer police force. Not all embraced change. Some veteran officers pushed back, and the union sought to curb reform impact. But public and media support created an unstoppable movement. The community's demand for justice forced the system to respond. One sunny afternoon, after a press conference on reform progress, James stood outside City Hall, gazing over the city. He sensed change slowly unfolding, reflecting on the journey from his clash with Harris to tense leader meetings. Everything had shifted, not just for him, but for the city. Michael approached, smiling softly. "You did it, James. Things are moving, and people see results," he said. James smiled, eyes fixed ahead. "Yes, but it's just the start. There's much more to do to ensure these reforms last. True justice isn't a finish line, it's a lifelong path." Michael nodded. "And you'll keep guiding the city on that path." James exhaled, knowing the fight for fairness and transparency was far from done. He'd carved a new road, and he wouldn't stop until every citizen, regardless of race or status, was treated justly. This wasn't just his story, it was the community's, a city advancing with hope and real change. "We're not turning back," James said, eyes on the horizon. "This is the only way forward, and we'll keep moving until everyone gets the justice they deserve." With those words, James stepped forward, continuing the journey, knowing he fought not just for himself, but for a generation spared the injustice he'd faced. This story wouldn't end now. It would live on through the lasting changes James and his community sparked. A fairer future beckoned, and James was ready to lead the city toward it. Thanks for watching today's story. If this message resonated and you want more like it, hit subscribe and turn on notifications to catch every new video. Let's spread positive, just values together. Thank you.